I had the pleasure of living at the lake, right on the lake, for 15 years as a young adult. Grew up volunteering and eventually working for a festival at the lake, but really just enjoying the nature. Being proud to know that this was our nation's first wildlife sanctuary. Getting to know the critters, waiting every year for the goslings to hatch and the little ducklings to follow their moms around. Lake Merritt is a living classroom. It is a legacy of past leaders who knew that having open space, having a place for nature to thrive and interact respectfully with people, that is a lasting gift for generations to come. And that's what we have to do. We have to make sure that this gift keeps on giving, that we honor it, that we honor the wildlife, and that we continue to create a beautiful, healthy, peaceful, restorative place right in the heart of Oakland, and that's Lake Merritt.
Well, Samuel Merritt was an early mayor of Oakland. He was a big guy. I think he was something like 350 pounds and 6'5", something like that. He sounds like he was a formidable fellow. Big bushy beard, and he owned land around the lake, and at that time it was the original Tidal estuary. There was a wider connection originally between the lake and the bay. It's still tidal to this day, of course, and that was part of our project to restore some of that. He built a dam, kind of like a levee-like dam that went across the mouth of the lake, and that way they were able to impound the water at high tide, and they had gates that would flap closed. They could control the water level that way, and they raised the water level basically above its normal swing of high and low tides to make it into a more of a aesthetically pleasing, in his opinion, and a recreational lake, as opposed to the tidal slough that it was before. Well, the people started calling it Merritt's Lake shortly after he built the dam, and eventually that morphed into Lake Merritt. Before that, this was part of San Antonio Creek. This is where the Oakland estuary is now. This was really an arm of San Antonio Creek. The story I've heard is that people used to do a lot of duck hunting out here, and stray shots would fly past the residents that were now moving in, including Sam Merritt, who had his place right out the shore of the lake. And the people who lived at the edge of the lake got tired of that, and they decided to make it into a wildlife refuge simply so they could ban the hunting and the scatters of birdshot that were flying back and forth. And so that was kind of the original impetus. But then the idea of a wildlife refuge and protecting the wild birds and so on, I think, gained momentum once people saw how nice the result was. So that's really the focus today, is on the wildlife as much as on the people that enjoy the recreation around and on the lake.
I'm Jim Covel, currently from Monterey, but I grew up here. My dad, Paul Covel, was the first naturalist here for the city of Oakland. In fact, the first municipal park naturalist anywhere in the United States. Right. This was actually his second office. The original office for the park naturalist here was actually a little, it was a maintenance closet wedged between two restrooms that were over by the dome cage, where the dome cage is today. And so he had a desk in there with hoses and quick couplers and things that the gardeners used, as well as big sacks of grain that they used to feed the birds. And so when they established this in 1953, this was a huge step up. He could move out of the closet between the restrooms and actually have an office, but moreover, just have a place where they could bring in school groups and the public and really do programs. And when the Rotary Natural Science Center was opened, then he felt like the naturalist program finally had a real home here at Lakeside Park. We had, of course, a huge population of waterfowl. That's why all this was established. And just back behind us in the yard where the birds gather was a big banding trap. And so from the mid-1920s until my father retired, they did bird banding here. And we could bait that trap with grain. Lots of ducks would go in there. We would drop the hatch on them, and then you could walk in and start pulling ducks out. And it was an assembly line process, banding hundreds of ducks in maybe just a couple of hours here, with a number of volunteers who would band them. And then, of course, in those days, that was our way of studying where all these waterfowl went. So our knowledge about the Pacific Flyway is based largely on banding records, many of which, in the case of waterfowl, came from right here in Lakeside Park. And out between the duck islands, there's a special banding trap also that was built just for diving ducks. And so the diving ducks could be baited in there as well. And then we would paddle out there in the boat, retrieve those ducks and band them as well. And for a long time, we held the banding record on the Pacific Flyway for birds like Barrow's goldeneye right here at Lake Merritt. And there are very few banding stations that were banding canvasbacks and goldeneye and bufflehead and those diving ducks. So those were particularly valuable records from here. In one case, a snow goose was banded here at Lake Merritt. Was actually shot by a hunter over in Siberia, and it actually demonstrated that some of these birds not only migrate north in the summer, but they may cross over to another continent. Father credit for he always knew that nature was important in people's lives, and it didn't matter where you lived, that you needed nature around you, and it was just part of what makes us whole as humans. And that was certainly a part of his growing up. And so when he landed here in the Bay Area, and here we had Lake Merritt, and we had this incredible park, as well as an amazing system of parks that Oakland had established, that was what his vision was, that there is nature available for people that live in at that time, a rapidly urbanizing environment. And it was going to be increasingly important for people to still have access to nature without having to leave town. And so bringing people right here into Lakeside Park and helping to point out the nature that they had as well was a big part of just keeping people in touch with their natural heritage, which is a big part of who we are. And that was his philosophy his entire life. I've often said he loves being with birds and with plants. Those were huge passions for him, but he would never be happy out of nature without other people to share it with. And that was pretty much the story of his life. And that inspired a lot of us, not just myself, but a lot of kind of junior naturalists that came through here and spent time here with my dad and went on to set up nature programs in other parts of the country, even other parts of the world. So these 5 duck islands were a project that started back in the mid-1920s when they were excavating ground for what was originally the Oakland Municipal Auditorium, now the Kaiser Auditorium. And they needed some place to dump the fill. And at the same time, the mayor of Oakland thought, you know, that we should have some places away from the shore where the waterfowl could nest, the ducks could nest there and wouldn't have to worry about stray dogs or anybody else bothering them. And it was a convenient place to dispose of some of that fill. So they started barging fill from the excavation for the auditorium across the lake and dumping it here, eventually forming these duck islands. And water was plumbed into at least the first couple of islands. There's a little freshwater pond on the island number 1 over here. And for many years that was also part of the rounds of the Lakeside Park gardeners, was to go out and trim things around the islands as well. And they made fabulous nesting areas for a lot of waterfowl. And then in recent years, as the trees matured out on the islands, then we started to see black-crowned night herons and egrets and great blue herons also starting to frequent the islands and eventually start nesting here as well. So they've served their purpose of providing a very secluded spot for a variety of different birds to nest, again, right here in the middle of Oakland. So behind me is this geodesic dome, and this was one of the first kind of demonstration dome projects anywhere in the country. In the late 1950s, the idea of that Buckminster Fuller had designed a freestanding structure with no internal supports. He called it geodesic dome. And the park superintendent for Oakland, Bill Mott at the time, read about that, and he thought, you know, in addition to being an amazing structure for people, it would be a fabulous free flight cage because there's nothing for birds to run into. They could fly around inside there. And he's really taken with that idea, and he and my father quickly became co-conspirators in that project. My dad could easily find birds that we could put in there, and so Bill Mott started in to build this, contacted Bucky Fuller, and then thought, let's make it out of aluminum, the new lightweight miracle material. So he talked to Henry Kaiser about donating the materials for this, and Kaiser was happy to show off what aluminum could do, and Fuller was happy to show off a geodesic dome, so everybody was in. They, again, got some money from the city, probably drummed up donations from some of the local service clubs who are always happy to support things like this. And by the early 1960s, we had this dome cage, and for many, many years we had kestrels, sparrowhawks in here. We had some native songbirds. Remember that because of the wildlife care function that went on here, a lot of birds were brought in that may not be releasable. They may have had some injury that pretty much prohibited their successful release. So what do you do with birds like that? And this was the perfect answer. So we could have a variety of local birds in here. They could fly a short distance, they could exercise around in the dome. We kept them well fed, so everybody got along together in there. And for many years, this was quite an attraction here at Lakeside Park, and one of the few places where you could see a really large-scale geodesic dome.
Yeah. It's such a model for support what people can do for wildlife, you know, and the ability, the whole point for the refuge was that people were going to set aside place for wildlife, not just waterfowl, but especially 150 years ago, the Pacific Flyway was such a critical, vital pathway for birds that are migrating through this area. And the San Francisco Bay Area was one of the premier stopping points for the wildlife, for the birds as they migrated through. So when they created the Lake Merritt Refuge, it was really setting aside an area that can support them through as they stop, and then make it really all the way, many of them all the way to South America. I think it becomes very clear how important it is to the birds that come through here because they're here. You know, it wouldn't if they weren't using it, if they didn't see it as a critical stopping point, then they wouldn't be here, and it would clearly be of no value. The fact that they use it, the fact that they concentrate here, is evidence enough that how important it is to help support them, and then turn around and give the people of Oakland an opportunity to see wildlife up close. what an honor it is to be part of this support for Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge. I think it's just one of the great visionary things that happened to be right here in Oakland, and that 150 years ago they had the vision to create this, and 150 years later we have the ability to still appreciate what they did for us. It's a magnificent opportunity to protect wildlife on the Pacific Flyway, but also the local bird population and wildlife population right here in Oakland. You know, what's really important is that we create different microclimates and micro parks that provide opportunities for wildlife, whether it's good feeding opportunities for birds, or whether it's butterfly gardens, or whether you get nature to be able to live right in the urban environment, so that the urban environment doesn't completely wipe out nature. It actually allows wildlife and nature itself to continue to thrive as in coexistence with people. So that's what's so magnificent about it. And it also provides an opportunity for people who are in an urban environment to link to nature and not to get too far away and to forget the fact that they are actually part of nature and that we're all in this together to make sure that the planet is preserved as we go forward.
What's your personal experience getting into birding?
God, I was a kid, and of all things, I was watching house sparrows, and they were eating out of a dog food bowl that I had put out. And you watch it and you think, oh, it's just a bunch of birds, but then as you watch it longer, you realize there's organization there, and there was no fighting. It was kind of, if you just looked at it, the average person looked at it, you just think, oh, flock of birds going over some food, but actually if you sat there and watched it, you analyzed and saw that they had an organization about it, and it was an eye-opener for me in terms of nature, and so that's when I really started looking at nature in a different way. Lake Merritt is part of the Central Flyway, so you get a lot of unique birds here in the wintertime, but there's also the residences here, and because this is one of the oldest wildlife refuges in the United States, the residents here have been here and some residents that you would not expect in the middle of an urban area like this, they're here. And that's because of the longevity of this refuge. But we're still a capital, brown California towhee capital of the world, and we have birds coming all the way over from Minnesota, right? The prairie potholes up there, the goldeneye and the bufflehead, and those kinds of birds actually spend a lot of their breeding season is in the prairie potholes, Minnesota, Canada, like that, and then they move back out here again in the winter. Yeah, the birds are amazing. What was I just reading? Pigeons, for example, they can get up to 50 miles an hour, and they can fly 600 miles in a day. Yeah, I dig a lot of the behavior and the inner relationships between birds and mammals and plants and things like that. So Merritt is unique in that it's right here in the city, and it's at a nexus space in the city, and so it's very accessible for just about anybody. There's so many buses and public transit, and you can walk here, and plenty of parking, so the fact that this is right in the urban area makes it even more important, especially for youth, so they can get here and see how these natural cycles work. They can go into the Rotary Nature Center and learn about how these natural cycles work, and that's what's important. Is the animals are great and they're fun, a great jump off point, but getting into understanding how nature works is so vital. It's so vital. So in your everyday life, in anybody's everyday life. So having the urban wildlife refuge and a nature center right in the middle of the city is not only unique, but it's super important for kids because it's so accessible.
Black-crowned heron. Yeah. A few years ago, a group of elementary school students came to my office, met with me a couple times, and said, listen, we should have an official bird of Oakland. Other cities have one. And they did a lot of research, and they said the black-crowned heron would be the ideal bird. And so I did some research myself, talked to the Audubon Society, talked with the children, and said, yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things is that the black-crowned heron is very prevalent around Lake Merritt and a few other places in Oakland. And so that is a logical bird for the city, but we want to make sure that the Lake Merritt environment is going to be safe for all the birds, whether it's the black-crowned heron or any bird on the Pacific Flyway that may come to the Oakland area. Lake Merritt is a place that birds rest on their trips. You know, they're going on from also from north to south or wherever they're going, and Lake Merritt is one of the official designations, if you will. They don't know that, but we know that where they go on, it's called a flyway, and so they stop at Lake Merritt in large packs, large groups. And so let's make sure that it's a place for them where they could survive. And so the work that's gone on to improving Lake Merritt and bring it up to a high standard over the past several years, we should all appreciate that and keep that work up and not let it fall back. For the black-crowned heron, for the residents of Oakland, for everybody. Let's make sure we keep our wonderful Lake Merritt for the past 150 years, keep it in a great shape because it's the crown jewel of our city, and let's make sure it's great for everyone.
Yeah, I'm a pretty avid birder. My background is ornithology and environmental law. So this is a great place to learn about birds, to advocate for a healthy environment, for an urban community. It's rare and special to have this extraordinary natural lake right in the center of a major city. Then we have regular seasonal birding activities to enjoy the wonderful migrants that come here and spend the winter with us. Then we come back to find out more about the nesting birds. You may know we have a very active double-crested cormorant nesting colony here. At its height, there were almost 200 nests. It's a little smaller now, but it's still very robust. Yeah, the bird count has changed a little bit. It's a little lower these days, but what's robust and still very vibrant is the variety of species. The Lake Merritt enjoys over 100 species of birds. And as I say, some of them are regular visitors that we look forward to seeing and who stay with us part of the year. Others are what we call residents who live their entire lives in this area and raise their families here. This area is for all the generations and how they learn from one generation to the next, where the food is, where the shelter is, where the danger areas are. And this is basically a message that's transmitted through the generations, and it helps birds survive. And for instance, we have a warming climate. This is going to change not only how Lake Merritt functions for the birds who are here, but for the birds that are finding some areas no longer habitable, and they may come and find Lake Merritt is safer and better for them. So birds are very adaptable up to a point. But true bird migration goes on many different directions, many transects, if you will. And here again, when you learn more about where a bird was hatched and raised, and how it cycles its life through this movement pattern and why it might be moving so great in so many distances back and forth, then you can more easily realize that it's not just a north-south pattern of the Pacific Flyway. It's much more complex than that. We have mountain ranges, we have waterways, we have desert, and they're actually timing their movements to take advantage of resources in different places at different times of the year, and also be sheltered from threats at different times of the year. So it's a form of intelligence that we're just now starting to understand and be very impressed by, frankly. So for instance, if you're talking about the pelicans that are here right now, why are these pelicans staying here? The American white pelican, not the brown. Why didn't they go with other of their what we call conspecifics or other pelicans to their breeding ground? Well, possibly because they're not old enough. They may be young. They may not yet be breeding age. This is a great place for them to hang around and do their version of social networking and learn and interact and socialize and establish pair bonds for a future time when they're old enough to breed. So they'll save their energy, they'll remain in a safe, sheltered space. So this is a welcome place for teenage pelicans. Many breeding birds in North America depend on caterpillars to feed their young. Chickadees, for example. That's the highest concentration of food that the chickadees give their young. And there was a time when, if you and I were standing here, there would be butterflies just flitting all over. But now we're seeing declines in butterflies. but we can restore them by bringing back the native plants, because native plants are what we call host plants for a variety of winged bugs, winged insects on which birds depend. We're advocating for conservation education about the entire life of a bird, not just while they spend their life, part of their lives here in Lake Merritt, but where they are and what they need for their entire lives to remain resilient and to remain a strong, robust population with all the challenges, and now the biggest one of climate change. And so another great
It was hard to choose because there are a lot of amazing birds that come to this lake. I felt that I really needed to represent the white pelican, because we have Hank who lives here year-round, and just coming over here I saw also our Canada goose. Everybody knows, and some people love and some people hate. And then of course the Oakland bird, the black-crowned night heron, which is one of my favorites. I guess. This is the eared grebe. We usually have up to 4 species of grebe that come to the lake, and then the ruddy duck, which is a wintering bird here as well, and then the American coot. They make the funniest squeaky noises that you could imagine. This would be one of the greater or lesser scout, which is another wintering bird, who often like to come down here by the Rotary Nature Center. One of my most favorite birds ever is the belted kingfisher. They're just a very charismatic bird. They have a lovely headdress on, and or one notable one I left off is this snowy egrets patrol the edge of the lake. I left off this bird here. He was deciding that he wants to be part of this interview. I know, I'm sorry I left you off. I'm sorry I left you out. You don't have to get that upset.
And here we have, a moment to celebrate a really remarkable event that in 1870s, way out in the Wild West, we have a refuge that was established, and that people were aware enough of the value of that. Changes were already happening in a very young Bay Area. Not 25 years before, there were only a few hundred European colonists in the area, and by the 1870s, there are tens of thousands of people have moved in from various parts of the world, and are rapidly changing the landscape and the seascape. And so one can imagine what really inspired that concept, that even in what we would regard today as a pretty natural environment, back in 150 years ago, there was already a sense to protect it, and now we have this great legacy. Oh my gosh, and unique. Where else can we find an environment as cool, as interesting, as a marine lake with parklands around it, accessible to such a wide array of the public? You don't have to pay to go there. It's free to anybody to go down and look in the water, walk along the shore, and get engaged with the natural environment.
The wildlife sanctuary at Oakland started in 1870, but science didn't really start there for over another 50 years. The interest at first was ducks, hunting ducks as entertainment, flocks of ducks as a tourist attraction. And it was ducks that eventually led to the first science, which was a bird banding program started up by a Piedmont businessman named E.W. Amon. But he put his money and his heart into this and started up a bird banding program, which went on for many decades. Bird bands were recovered up and down the wildlife corridors along the West Coast, and gave us a lot of knowledge of the Western Flyway. Bird from as far away as Siberia. A band was recovered that had been banded in Lake Merritt. And so it was a very successful program that went on largely by volunteer effort with assistance from the federal government. Our next phase in science didn't occur for another 37 years. when a 14-year-old boy who was about to start in the 9th grade at Oakland High School wandered down to the shore and felt something go crunch under his foot. That crunch led him to look at what it was, which was this sort of gnarled mass of intertwined white calcareous tubes that looks kind of odd, and led him the next week to go into the Rotary Science Center here behind me and ask about what it was. Display there, he discovered that these tubes were created by a sea worm from the Southern Ocean, and that got him interested. He started to spend time down at the lake and try and figure out what it was, and the next summer he began a serious program of studying Lake Merritt. The boy's name was Jim Carlton, and he went on to discover that Lake Merritt was largely full of organisms from other parts of the world. He corresponded with the world's scientists to try and figure out what they were. He eventually went on to do a PhD on this topic and founded a field of science, the study of marine biological invasions, started here at Lake Merritt. And that's something that few other cities' great open spaces can claim, none that I'm aware of. Not Central Park in New York, not Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, not the Royal Parks of London. None of them founded a field of science, but Oakland's great blue open space did in fact start a field of science here. The next major step in Oakland's science here around Lake Merritt came actually in 1996, when an Oakland High school teacher named Katie Noonan got a grant to put a lab in down at the boathouse, and with a colleague of hers started up the Science Academy, in which the students often spent their time down here studying the life of Lake Merritt, sampling, observing, identifying organisms, recording their observations. And so this was another phase in the science that involved teachers and students cooperating around this urban open space. And then in Lake Merritt, what is really astonishing is that there are a lot of people now around who live around the lake, who live in Oakland, who live in the area, who have become interested in understanding the life of Lake Merritt. And it's a phenomenon of the last decade or so. And I think some of the things that have really helped with it is the creation of the internet and of places where people can post their observation and post their photographs, and the fact that everyone has a cell phone with a camera in it and they can actually take high quality photographs of the things that they find. And so and with that, and with this ability to communicate with other people, what we have is this accessible open space in the middle of a city, which is also wild because it's connected to the ocean. The ocean is really the one untamed habitat we have left on this planet. We have affected it in many ways, but it still retains deep mysteries. And even Lake Merritt contains its mysteries. You can't immediately see what's underneath it. You have to work a little bit to get it. And there is science to be discovered here by these citizen naturalists, self-taught, by virtue of making the effort and having the observations and recording them and photographing them and communicating them. There is the opportunity to make contributions to science by all of that.
A naturalist is a worldwide social network of nature lovers. So it's sort of a platform that lets you post pictures or sounds that you recorded from nature of other organisms, and other people around the world will help you identify them. And there's also a computer vision based automated suggestion system, so you can just point your phone at a flower and it'll automatically tell you what it is, hopefully.
What are some unique things about Lake Merritt?
Well, it's an urban estuary, which is fairly unusual in a lot of cities. It's a wildlife refuge in the heart of a major American metropolis, which is pretty cool. For me, it's interesting just because it's as cosmopolitan biologically as the Bay Area is culturally. You know, like you can look at it as being a highly invaded ecosystem, but another way of looking at it is just being a really amazingly diverse sampling of worldwide marine biota, which makes it definitely an interesting place to pay attention to. When I moved out to the Bay Area after college, I sort of had to relearn all of my natural history because I grew up in Connecticut, which is ecologically extremely different than California. So when I arrived in the Bay, all the birds were different, all the trees were different, everything was different, and I had to relearn. But I was relearning as an adult with the internet and a digital camera, so it was very different than my learning process as a child. And that's kind of where the idea for iNaturalist came from, was that this is a cool way of doing natural history, of sort of sharing information, recording information, sharing it online, and getting help from total strangers who are just also interested in nature and want to help you out and tell you what things are.
I mean, Lake Merritt is like no other place I've really even visited, in that it's such an interesting combination of organisms from all over the planet that have kind of reached, to some degree, an equilibrium. So I kind of joke with a lot of people that it is probably the best place to study the Anthropocene from a marine perspective, because you've got organisms from just about every place Oakland has ever traded with sitting here in the middle of the city. So for anyone that's walking around the lake, or about, like, I'd say 80–90% of them, if they see me in the water, they first are freaked out that I'm going to lose a limb, and then when I show them that there's anything growing in there, they find that just overwhelmingly unique, unpredictable, and that's as simple of things as like mussels, which are just everywhere. You show them a sea anemone and half the people kind of lose their minds that even exists here. I think for me, after seeing a lot of things in the lake year after year, some of the most impressive things that I've seen in the lake, I found Santa Barbara janilis, actually just right out there over in that corner. And that's an organism that I'm used to only really seeing like more towards like the open Pacific intertidal zone, something I really never expected to see in Lake Merritt. And then also one winter, we found this little tiny polychaete that was basically just a rainbow of colors, originally from Australia, and this was the furthest north that it's ever been seen. It's been seen a handful of times in the Ventura Harbor, but it's basically for the West Coast, Ventura Harbor and Lake Merritt is where that thing exists.
The fact that all these species from around the world are living together in Lake Merritt, I think is an interesting analogy to peoples from all over the world coming together. And in the ecological world, we talk about competition and the replacement or displacement of what used to be there before. We clearly know that in terms of human history, where one set of peoples come in and displace or replace the people who were there, the Aboriginal people, Native Americans in this case. So we have seen those dynamics, whether it's worms or people coming in, and yet while we can't do much about invading amphipods and polychaete worms, one hopes we can do a lot better with people. And it was a thriving, compelling nature center. And that's probably due to Paul Covel's wise stewardship since he arrived there decades earlier. Lectures, and I think he invited me to give my first lecture there when I was either 15 or 16 years old. And I had my Kodachrome slides, little 2x2 slides, and we had the slide projector, and he would send out little postcards on his mailing list, and announcing the lecture series, and would send them out every week, and we would have an audience there. And I was 15 or 16 when I gave my first lecture about the marine life of Lake Merritt. Paul was very kind to host me and give me my early experience in public lecturing. My mother would often come and start the clapping. But again, it was such an encouraging environment. That was really what was key. And Paul would have done that with anybody, insects, plants, birds, trees, marine invertebrates. He just wanted people to get out there and be with nature and understand the diversity, and learn their Latin names, get them correct, and was just thrilled with what I was doing. I'm sure without that initial support at the Nature Center, I probably would not have really launched my studies there, because it was really an anchor for me. After completing my rounds every weekend around the lake, that was about my last stop. I would go into the Nature Center and I would report my findings to Paul, what I had seen that day around the lake. And anything new I had found.
Well, I am very excited to be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Wildlife Refuge as a teacher. which is my primary identification at this point, I would say.
But over time,
this idea has increased in importance and it's evolved. And it gives us a message for the future that we can conserve and we can treasure this lake and what it can teach us. I was drawn to the Rotary Center by Stephanie Benavides and her program here at the Rotary Nature Center. She was a naturalist and she was the supervising naturalist. For most of the time I taught and had my Environmental Science Academy students meeting at Lake Merritt once a week to study the lake. And Stephanie was wonderful with high school kids. She would give them jobs, keep them busy, talk to them. She was wonderful in reaching out to the full diversity of students that I taught. I really valued that in her. And she was knowledgeable about the ecology of the lake, having been trained by Rex Burris, who succeeded Paul Covel. Lately we've been exploring underwater at Lake Merritt using a underwater drone called the Trident. Trident is driven from basically a Game Boy platform with all the familiar controls, so people can just step right in and drive it around to see what's under the water. A lot of stuff on the bottom. Also, being a really rich lake, there's a lot of life that is down there, growing over everything that has fallen in the lake. So sometimes it's really hard to discern what might be down there.
Okay, yeah. So Lake Merritt is a really special place for Oakland, and in a way like San Francisco Bay and where our Bay Observatory is, we've really tried to connect people to the dynamics of our environment, and that's exactly what Katie's doing. She's been monitoring with her students the water quality here, the flora and fauna that's here for nearly 20 years. That's an incredible accomplishment to have students growing up learning what it means to steward a place and to study it long term. If we think about climate change and we think about our future in cities, we really need young people to understand how to care for a place over time. And that's what Katie does.
Cities are growing. People are moving to cities. Oakland is booming. And we cannot let that growth impinge on this natural sanctuary. We have to honor the wildlife, the very fragile and delicate ecosystem that this lake and the different waterways that feed it and its journey out into the Pacific Ocean, all of that has to be respected and supported. We have to make sure that this lake stays healthy for the non-human habitats, the people, the critters, the plants that depend on this ecosystem to thrive. That is what will keep the lake healthy, which in turn will keep us healthy.
At the time. And so I was probably 5 years old when I first came to Lake Merritt. I grew up in Oakland. But my main focus on the lake began in 2003. Shortly it was around the year 2000 that a planning process began, the Lake Merritt Master Plan. And so when in 2003 the bonds were sold, that's when I came in from Public Works to work on the implementation of about 50 projects overall around the city of the lake. And Measure DD really made a significant difference in that respect. There were other aspects of Measure DD related to water quality and also historic building renovation, the municipal boathouse, the boating center here at the sailboat house, some of the seawalls, things like that were all other projects, the pergola, East 8th Street Pier. Our Measure DD improvements, when we opened the channel that runs between Lake Merritt and the estuary, one of our major projects was to dig out the restrictive culverts at 12th Street and also at 10th Street, where the water in and out of the lake was really choked down. Had to go through these little pipes under the roadways. So we ripped out all the pipes, built clear spanning bridges over them, and that way we could get a 100-foot wide channel bringing tidal water in and out with the idea of doubling the flow that goes in and out of Lake Merritt twice a day. Along with that, we created a tidal marsh just below what is now Lake Merritt Boulevard, between there and 10th Street. Scooped an area that had been filled in 100 or more years ago, dropped it 10 feet back down to sea level, made about 2/3 of an acre of tidal marsh that was just at sea level and just a hair above. So as the high tide moves up and down into the marshland, we planted pickleweed, jalmea, gum plant in the upper areas, some marsh baccaris, things like that. Yeah, this is one area we were able to establish some. To create a marsh has to be quite flat, about a 1% grade, 1 in 100, nearly flat in order to work properly. So you need an area that you can pull back from the lake, the existing shoreline, and lay it back flatter so that you can get that marsh installed. Here we had a little bit of room. Originally we had a parking lot directly behind me that was very close to the lake that served the sailboat house. We were able to shrink the size of the parking lot in half and shove it away from the lake. We had an old creosote treated retaining wall here, ripped that out, and then we were able to grade it back, as you see here, and plant the bands of marsh plants. You can see each plant has a particular elevation that it likes, more or less period of inundation during the day. And so you'll see pickleweed at the very bottom, you'll see jalmea coming up here, saltgrass up above that, all blending together. Higher you get into the more shrubby plants up here. On a typical tidal cycle before the projects, we're looking at 17% of the lake's water getting exchanged in one tidal cycle. With the new 10th Street, 12th Street wide open, and if the gates were wide open, we would be up there nearly at 40% of the lake's volume exchanging with every tidal cycle. But I'm afraid that because of the tide gates are closed, we're back down close to that 17% we originally had. And unfortunately that's affected the water. There are other ideas for putting in aerators in the lake. We did get a couple of fountains running, but an aeration fountain uses an awful lot of electrical energy. In my mind, a more natural approach that didn't use a fantastic amount of electrical energy with the associated greenhouse gases and so on, just by simply restoring the tidal flow as an easy, natural way that has other benefits was clearly the way to go. And it certainly...
Well, originally nature was something to be feared. I mean, it was wilderness. People didn't go there. They didn't stay there. There were beasts out there. They could kill you, and they did. They would eat you. But gradually people came to become more familiar with nature. We started to look at them and catalog them and find out what they were and give them names. People like John James Audubon began to paint nature, and then along came a guy named Charles Darwin, and he cataloged so many things about nature and looked at them, the differences, and he discovered evolution, and the world has never been the same. So nature study has really been pretty important. And as the years went by, a guy named Aldo Leopold coined the phrase and wrote about it, the land ethic, and that told us to respect nature. It was followed by the conservation movement. That was followed, later by animal rights. So the Nature Center kind of followed that path a little bit. Initially you had animals in cages, and concern for the welfare of the animals led to, well, we don't want to keep them in cages anymore. And nature studied nature, moved outdoors. People like to take photographs of them. People wrote books like Rachel Carson. And since then it's continued to evolve. So what should be our focus at the Rotary Nature Center for the next 50 years? To me, it's habitat. Two things, habitat and climate change. Habitat because it's the basis of all nature. It's the basis of wildlife. Without habitat, you don't have wildlife. You don't have nature. And I think there are opportunities here at Lake Merritt to enhance the habitat. We can put in artificial reefs in lake. We can have areas of natural vegetation. So we don't have all these areas. Well, that's depending on how you name them. 4 or 5 major creeks come into it, and there are, I've forgotten the number, there are over 1,000 or so more curb inlets that come into the lake. 4,650 acres all drain into our little 160-acre lake. That concentrates the trash. That's why after a rainfall, when the watershed is washed down into Lake Merritt, you see trash here. There are flood control gates on the channel leading out to the Oakland Inner Harbor and the estuary. Actually, of course, I hope you know, the Lake Merritt is not a lake. It's a tidal estuary with tides coming in and out every day. The water goes up and down twice a day, high tide, higher high, low, lower low. And if there's a chance of flood, they close the tide gates, which closes off the incoming water. They let the water go out. They open the gates on the outgoing tide to let the water out, reduce chances of a flood. But when those gates are closed and the rain comes in, fresh water, this is a saltwater estuary, the lake stratifies, fresh water here, salt water below, and it doesn't mix, so the oxygen down here goes down to 1, maybe 0. And that's another reason why the lake is listed as an impaired body of water for oxygen as well as for trash. Now that they've widened the channel, we have better opportunity to fine-tune the gate closure because we can get water out of the lake faster. With all the advanced knowledge we have of rainfall, how much water is coming off, with flow meters in the creeks telling us how much water is coming down, we can really fine-tune that and minimize the time that the gates are closed. I'm not saying let the lake flood. Floods are bad, but we can fine-tune it so that we reduce the amount of time that oxygen here is low.
In the city. And one of the many things that's special about Lake Merritt is how accessible it is to the people who live right here in Oakland, right near Oakland. People of all backgrounds and all economic levels make use of this nature, and Lake Merritt still supports nature because of the efforts for over a century of people to take care of the nature right here, to take care of the wildlife as a refuge, to take care of the water quality by reducing the trash and pollution that's getting into it, and by taking care of the public access around the lake, the walkways, the lawns, the trees, and all the things that make Lake Merritt special. So Save the Bay is very proud of the efforts that local citizens have made over many years to protect Lake Merritt for all of us. The City of Oakland, thanks to pressure from citizens, is doing more to reduce trash on the streets and capture more trash before it flows into Lake Merritt. And why is that a problem? Well, trash is unsightly. Obviously, it's a huge disruption to our enjoyment of the water, to see trash in the water. It's also a threat to wildlife, to birds and to fish that ingest that trash. They can choke on it and starve to death. And also, even the small bits of trash are poisonous and build up in the bodies of the wildlife that eat it and concentrate up the food chain. So that's a huge problem. Now, there's a legal requirement throughout the Bay Area for cities to reduce trash to 0 by 2022. Very ambitious target. We've already made a lot of progress to reduce it, but there's much more work to do. These are candy wrappers, packaging. We have, these are really common. Cigarette lighters, the plastic, they float, they have toxic fuel inside them. They're really a combination of all the worst things. And there's so much plastic. This is very light, so it blows. And even people who put the trash in a trash container, if that doesn't get emptied often enough by the city, it just blows right out, and then it's back there out in the environment. So.
501c3 nonprofit organization. We care for the lake, the health of the water. We maintain aeration fountains, remove trash, urban runoff from the lake. We also do educational presentations about the dangers of urban runoff. We're contracted through the city. We're sponsored by the city of Oakland and by beloved citizens that are members of our organization.
What's the function of the fountains?
Okay, so the fountains, which are on if they're not down due to like marine growth and other mechanical problems, they put oxygen back into the water. So oxygen is badly needed in the lake. It's important for the marine life inside of the lake to have oxygen inside of the water. So in areas where there's not a lot of circulation, there's not a lot of oxygen, we put those fountains there to replenish the oxygen. Well, I used to teach sailing at the Lake Merritt Boating Center, and I was talking to Dr. Bailey one day, and he was asking me different questions about the lake, and a lot of it I did not know. And he famously told me the difference between a storm drain and a sewer, which I had no idea. Very important difference to know, because if it's going to the sewer, it's going somewhere where the water is treated, articles are removed from the water. If it's a storm drain, usually trash in, trash out. And that's what we have at Lake Merritt, 63 plus storm drains. And when trash washes in from 7 square miles, it washes, for the most part, into the lake unfiltered. The trash correlates with the rain. So as the rain increases, generally speaking, the trash levels rise as well. Certain things like a trash boom that we implement, that we put in, the city actually puts in, and we advocate for these different things, are working. Or certain storm drain filters that come in, are these working to reduce the trash in a significant way, or do we need to go back to the drawing table? So the measurements of trash plays a role in pretty much everything that we do. Volunteers are the lifeblood of the organization. We have our beloved 18 who come down, and they've been with us for years, and they know everything from the new equipment that we have to clean up the lake to the procedures that we implement. So they're a great group to have down at the lake, and that's on Tuesdays at 10:30. And then we have another one for the general public on Saturdays, and that's generally when we get school groups and just other random volunteers that want to come and volunteer, but not on a work week. So the You Clean It boxes are boxes that we have strategically placed around the lake that hold equipment so volunteers are never too far away from the cleaning stations. And they have gloves, nets, barrels, everything that you'll need to clean a lake safely. And they're there, they have sign-in sheets and a how-to sheet in there, so you'll know the proper procedures when you're using the lake, when you're using the boxes rather, and they come in handy when we have large groups come down or just random people volunteering at the lake. I talk about a multitude of things. One of the things is that why it's so important to come down and volunteer, the efforts of us to clean up remove trash from the lake, because it harms the wildlife that are here, because it's a connection between the wildlife and trash. We often find dead animals that's dead from ingesting too much trash. And so I always tell the children when they do come down and volunteer that each piece of trash that you're removing from the lake is potentially saving a bird's life. Oh, Hank, I have a very good relationship with Hank. I actually wrote a book called A Bird's Tale about Hank and his journey to Lake Merritt. And the purpose of the book is to get kids from Oakland more interested in the wildlife, because my personal thought is that if we can encourage the next generation coming up to care and have a personal connection with the wildlife here, then they'll fight even more than us to protect those animals, because they can't, fight for protection themselves.
And you also what is the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club?
It was originally started by a group of businessmen, prominent businessmen in Oakland, and they were meeting right behind me at the Lake Merritt Hotel, and they would sit there and look over this beautiful lake, and they said, we need to promote Lake Merritt and its park and get more people. It started in 1933, and Paul Covel, he was a local naturalist, very interested in Lake Merritt and its development and the unique characteristics that it had. And as a knowledgeable speaker, we realized it would be good if he would host speaking engagements on a weekly basis to enlighten the community about all the special assets that Lake Merritt has. The Breakfast Club all got together and raised a little money and actually paid him to come in and give these speaking engagements, which were robustly attended. There was a lot of people that came down to learn about the birds and the different aspects of Lake Merritt, and he was a great speaker, and he was very passionate, and a good blend of community support for him and his knowledge back to the community. About 1983 '83 and '84, we started to work on restoring the necklace of lights around that borders Lake Merritt. And it was originally installed in, I think, 1925, and they shut it down during World War II, and it fell in disrepair. And we decided we wanted to restore it to its natural beauty. We raised about $4 million through the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club Charitable Foundation to put this back in shape, and we opened in 1987, and they featured the necklace of lights on national TV, and we also had a fireworks show here to relight the necklace, and it has been glowing ever since, and we still...
The lake has always been this drawing force that brings people together, to peacefully protest, to dream together of a better world and future. I'll never forget the time when people stood around the entire lake holding their hands together and raised up to the sky in a show of unity and hope for a better future. That is what the lake does. It brings people together. When you sit on the side of the lake, you see Oakland walk by. Everyone, every language, every kind of person, every makeup of what we believe is a family, they are here at the lake, and it's a place that welcomes everyone.
I do. I ride around the lake. It's part of my habitat. Truly the heart of the city. And look at the shoreline, the reconfigured streets and roads have just engendered an onslaught of people flocking to Lake Merritt. This is where everybody comes, whether they have wings or feet. And so this is what, to me, it provides that excitement that we all want, that community. And that is so important, as well as the educational experience. Last September, I learned a lot about invertebrates in Lake Merritt, and on a tour with the Nature Center guides. And that's the kind of enlightenment that we all need. But I think about the youngsters, the people who are inspired by learning about what's under the water, what's overhead, looking at the nests, protecting our habitats, and seeing that they continue into the future to provide new generations of help for protecting our environment.
Oh my goodness, I use the lake in so many ways. It's my brag spot when people come from out of town and we look at the beautiful lights of the lake, and I love telling people it's a natural lake, because when I first moved here, people would try to tell me it was a man-made lake, and it's just such a beautiful part of, you know, California. It's a beautiful part of my life. It's a place where I come for contemplation. It's a place where I pray. It's a place where I cry. It's a place where I brought my son to feed the ducks. It's memory, it's laughter, it's tears. It's wow, it's loving the diversity of our community that's all here. You know, like, it's climbing up on the tree that fell in the windstorm and standing there and thinking how small we are and how big they are. It's listening to the trees, you know? The lake is, it's magic, and then it's a mix of cultures and classes, and yet it's so beautiful. Have you ever been at the lake? It's even like, for me, it's like a symbol of Oakland's resilience and renaissance, right? Right, and then it's also pain, right? We've got unhoused people here. We've got that humanitarian challenge that's really on the banks of our city, and you wonder how you have the penthouse and the poverty within feet of each other. So Lake Merritt it really is the heart of our town. It's our community. It's everybody's park. It's our central park, and man, the story of love and joy and pain and hope that are on these shores is so amazing to me.
Sanctuary. My most vivid experiences of this part of the lake are certainly taking my daughter, who's now 16, but taking my daughter here when she was just a toddler to play, to say hello to the birds, to learn about the different wildlife that is here, and to really appreciate this space, because between the gardens and the wildlife refuge, it's an incredible space to learn. So, you know, I think one of the issues that I'm trying to address, along with others in the city and the community, is how do we ensure that our park is open, inclusive, equitable, welcoming for every single person who wants to use it. Because we have a situation as we've been growing where not that many people have their own backyards or front yards. People are living more and more in apartments in very small spaces. We've been sheltering in place for months. And so outdoor space is incredibly important. And I think one of the challenges is that so many people love our lake, and so sometimes the number of people overwhelms the space that we have, and we really have to manage that when we're living in close quarters, you know, recreating. Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the important contributions of the Rotary Nature Center is that here we are in an urban environment. And we can come to the lake, we can learn about the wildlife that is here and the history of the wildlife, not only the birds, which are pretty obvious, but even some of our land creatures. And, you know, it's sort of a way to connect with nature in an urban environment when your family may not go hiking or camping or do things out further away in nature. And this is a place to sort of come and connect with issues of environmental stewardship, with wildlife, and my daughter certainly did that, I think.
And what's so critical and wonderful about Lake Merritt, I think, is it's in the middle of an urban space, but it's part of a main watershed of the East Bay. And there's so much to learn here just about the science and the ecology of this area, but it's also true that it's kind of the heart of Oakland in a way. When there are demonstrations, quite often, as we've just seen in the last several weeks, they resolve here. So the fact that it's rich with environmental history, it's rich with civic dialogue. Congratulations to Oakland for also being the first wildlife refuge. And if you put that all together in the middle of a bustling city, it's just congratulations. What a wonderful future, and you need to keep building on it.
That was good. And they were great behind you. Look. They spread out.
I'm very happy to be here today to represent the club when we're celebrating 150th anniversary of Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge. As Many of you know probably the lake is a salt lake, and it was a refuge for actually a lot of wildlife species. And one thing that we definitely need to acknowledge that it's an Ohlone land, and before settlers came in, there were a lot of wildlife here. We had salmon actually spawning in adjacent creeks, and bears, and some say that there were even wolves around here. So this is a really rich area for wildlife habitat. And of course now Lake Merritt is home to so many migrating birds and you can see here amazing feasts. Sometimes if you haven't been here, please come by, because it's an amazing show when pelicans are diving for fish. I actually saw, I think it was a seal once. So it's an amazing habitat. Actually, also another thing, I saw a stingray in the lake too. So make sure to watch closely and look for the stingray also. Lake Merritt is the largest saltwater lake, from what I understand, in the nation within urban limits. So it's an amazing space, and because the lake is saltwater, you can see a lot of actually fish schools coming into the lake, and that's when the most exciting time happens actually, because the birds are diving in the water, and just really fascinating spot for anybody. And it's truly, that's why it's called the jewel of Oakland, and it really is. So I welcome everybody to come enjoy. Oh wow, white pelicans!
You know, in the 1950s, there was not a goose here at all. In fact, Canada geese were pretty unusual on this flyway. And that was another one of those birds. My dad thought, well, there should be Canada geese here. Historically, they used to be here. So he found a farmer up in Dixon that had rescued some Canada geese that had been crippled by hunters, but they were still, they couldn't fly, broken wings. This farmer rescued them. My dad went up and I think he got 7 or 9 Canada geese from this farmer up in Dixon. Brought them down, turned them loose. Since they couldn't fly, he
Look
knew
what
they would
happened.
stay. And it's funny. That's one of the things I remember before he passed away. He said, you know, I was pretty proud of a lot of the things I did, but I might have overdone it with the Canada goose thing.
Oh my God.
It's a problem in some places.
Kind of.
I'm David Wofford, co-chair of the Rotary Nature Center Friends here at the Wildlife Refuge at Lake Merritt in Oakland, California. I found myself at the lake because it's such a beautiful park and it's here at the center of the city. And so, frankly, it wasn't no activism, it was just a living, a playing, and an enjoying of life. And it was only later that I began to be aware of the wildlife and the ecosystem that was maintained and understood and learned about at the lake. And as I began to learn about it and understand its relationship to the rest of our society and the world that we live in, I became fascinated by this ecosystem, and I became fascinated by the process of sharing it with other people here. And the work of Paul Covel and others like him, and their commitment and dedication, is something that has inspired me as I've begun to do this work and engage in it. You know, frankly, the family and community that I come from really find it questionable that a person could devote this amount of time and living and life to, you know, bugs and insects and birds. And you know, I'm constantly challenged by that, even as I try and flip the script and challenge them to be more interested in fish and insects and birds, and to understand the interrelatedness of it. So that's the goal for us here now.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the voters of Oakland that passed Measure DD in 2002. by 80%, and we're seeing the fruition of that now here around the lake with all the improvements, and with the hopefully the successful conclusion and improvements to Estuary Park, we're getting close to finishing. And congratulations to the folks in Oakland for doing that. I also wanted to acknowledge the first Native peoples that inhabited this land and the first stewards, the Huchian and their Loni. And we're going to give these as a gift, and it's a map of the natives of the native people of the East Bay, and we'll make that accessible to the Rotary Nature Center to acknowledge the first stewards of the land.
I do remember coming here and learning from the naturalists. They were really wonderful with young people. And you know, when you're young, you really focus in on the area. And you know, I remember learning about the night herons, which were quite exotic to me as a child, the pelicans that used to visit this area. And to me, it just seemed like this large place. To me, it wasn't like this little nature area in the middle of a larger urban area. It was this amazing place where you could come and interact with nature and have the naturalists, who are sort of your guides, teach you about them. I learned many things from them. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors, me, Dee, and our friends, of the East Bay Regional Park District does hereby proclaim its appreciation and congratulations for the significant 150th anniversary of the Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge and the importance of stewarding of this very important natural asset in the heart of the city of Oakland.
This beautiful refuge became the first in the nation to stand out for conservation. And over this 150 years, volunteers have kept the mission going and growing, including now making sure people understand ecology in a very real way, keeping us close to nature while we're in the midst of this beautiful and sometimes troubled urban environment. I'm so very proud of the work of this place where we see migratory birds and families and people who come and go. So as we are the stewards now, having succeeded from the Ohlone of this land, I want to wish you all the very best for another 150 years of conservation, of connection, of community and care. Thank you.
You know I'm like so many Oaklanders, that when I need to recharge or unplug, I come to the lake. But there is something about the circular journey with a friend in the sunshine, with the beautiful diversity of Oakland all around you, with the happy dogs and the happy kids and the happy families, the lovers, even people who are struggling in their lives. Everyone is at home at Lake Merritt.